Police arrest black man for loitering outside his own building. Then this happens. The afternoon sun bore down gently on the cracked sidewalk, casting long shadows along a quiet street in a neighborhood still clinging to its dignity. A black man in a fitted navy coat stood outside a modest three-story brick building. His hands were in his pockets, his posture relaxed, his gaze lifted toward the facade. There was a quiet pride in his eyes, though he said nothing. The building wasn't flashy, not new, but it was his. After years of saving, of skipping meals, of sleeping in his car while working double shifts and putting himself through school at night, today was the day it became official. Deed signed, keys in his pocket. But to the two white police officers cruising down the block, he didn't look like someone who owned anything at all. The squad car slowed. Then it stopped. One officer pointed. The other nodded. A second later, the engine cut. The man barely noticed until the voice broke the stillness. "Hey, what are you doing here?" He turned, brows raised, surprised by the tone more than the question. "Just waiting," he answered calmly. "Waiting for someone." "This your building?" The voice carried the sharpness of assumption. The other officer had already stepped out, hand resting near his belt. "Yes," the man replied. But he didn't get to finish. "Put your hands where we can see them," the first one ordered. And just like that, the weight of the badge overpowered the truth of the deed in his pocket. They didn't listen. He tried to explain that he was the owner, that the lawyer was on the way, that they could call the city and verify the deed just filed that morning. But his voice was drowned out by the clink of handcuffs, the shout of orders, and the humiliation of being pressed against the very door he now owned. Neighbors peeked from windows. A woman pulled her child closer. A camera phone clicked from across the street. He had imagined many things when he signed those papers. This was not one of them. This was the moment the world cracked open and the story began. Before we go any further, I want to welcome you to Cracks of Light, where we tell true, emotional stories that shine through darkness. If stories like this move you, if you believe in justice and the quiet power of dignity, then subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Every interaction helps us keep these stories alive. And now, back to the moment that changed everything. His name was Elijah Booker, 38 years old, a quiet man, the kind you'd walk past on the street without noticing. But if you did, you'd remember something steady about him. A former HVAC technician who lost his job during a massive downsizing 3 years ago. Since then, he'd worked odd jobs, fixed boilers, rewired kitchens, done drywall for people who paid in cash, and sometimes didn't pay at all. He lived lean, cooked one-pot meals, gave up cable, drove a beat-up sedan with a heater that rattled in winter. But he had one dream: to own property. Not to get rich, not to show off, just to create something lasting. A home that couldn't be taken from him. A space that would stand as proof. I was here. I mattered. But that morning, standing on his own stoop with his arms yanked behind him, none of that mattered. His name didn't matter. His clean record didn't matter. His bank statements didn't matter. What mattered was the color of his skin and the fact that he was standing still in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong body. Loitering, the officer wrote in his pad. Refused to vacate private property. Elijah said nothing. He'd learned that silence could sometimes protect you better than pleading. He'd been taught by men older than him to stay calm, stay still, stay breathing. And so he did. He sat in the back of the police car, watching the world tilt sideways through the narrow rectangle of glass. The building, his building, shrinking as the cruiser pulled away. On the sidewalk, a man in a tailored suit walked briskly toward the front door, waving a folder in one hand. His lawyer. 30 seconds too late. Elijah's story didn't begin in handcuffs. It began in loss. Years earlier, he had watched his mother, once a school librarian, forced to move from their family home after foreclosure. She had taught him the value of books, of showing up on time, of honesty. But none of that had saved her from eviction. He held her hand as she cried in a shelter parking lot, clutching a bag of clothes. That memory stayed with him. When she passed away from a stroke 2 winters later, he promised her gravestone. "One day, I'll build something that no one can take from us again." And so he worked, quietly, tirelessly, paid attention to neighborhood listings, talked to small-time agents who most buyers ignored. The building he bought had been empty for 2 years. Needed work, but the bones were solid. The neighborhood was on the edge of redevelopment. And when the sale went through, He stood outside with pride. Until the police made sure he couldn't. At the precinct, no one asked him why he was there. No one cared. He was just another arrest. Booked. Fingerprinted. Left in a cell with a flickering light and a cold bench. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that the door opened again. The lawyer had arrived. With documents. With fury. With the weight of law and the sound of raised voices in the hallway. You arrested the owner of the building, the lawyer said. His name is on the deed. Filed today. You want the city clerk to verify it. Silence. Then stammered apologies. The cuffs were removed. But the damage lingered. Elijah didn't yell. He didn't threaten a lawsuit. He didn't demand anything. He simply asked for his documents back, folded them into his jacket, and walked out into the late afternoon sun. But something had shifted. Not just in him. In the people who had witnessed it. The officer with the notepad avoided his eyes. A young clerk at the desk whispered, "Sorry, sir," too softly for anyone else to hear. And across town, the man who had filmed the arrest uploaded the video to social media with a single caption. They arrested the new owner. Within hours, the story spread. Not because it was rare, but because it was familiar. Too familiar. And this time, there were receipts. The deed. The footage. The calm dignity of a man who said nothing and still made the loudest noise. But for Elijah, the world was quieter than ever. He went home, if you could call the half-gutted building that yet. He opened the door, stepped over the loose floorboard, and sat down on a plastic crate. In his lap, the folder with the deed. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just sat there, letting the silence hold him. The police had taken a moment from him. But they hadn't taken his building. They hadn't taken his mother's memory. And they hadn't taken the quiet fire that still burned in his chest. And somewhere, in a newsroom across town, a producer replayed the video again. 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 We need to reach out to him, she said. People need to hear this. But Elijah wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted to fix the roof before the rain came. And yet, the world was about to come knocking anyway. Because ownership does not always wear a suit. And dignity does not raise its voice. But it stands. It stays. It holds its ground. Even when handcuffed. Even when doubted. Even when humiliated. This was not the end of his story. It was the beginning. And he didn't even know yet. One of the officers would soon go live on television, face pale, lips tight, and offer an apology the whole country would hear. But that's a moment for later. For now, all that mattered was a man sitting in his own building. Quiet. Unmoved. Unbothered. Still standing. Still here. Still home. Elijah returned to the building the next morning with a broom in one hand and a toolbox in the other. The air was damp, the sky clouded, but the street was quiet again. The yellow caution tape the officers had left behind still fluttered at the doorway, and he quietly removed it, folded it into a square, and tossed it in the trash. He didn't want to think about yesterday. He had walls to patch, pipes to inspect, a new lock to install. But the neighborhood hadn't forgotten. Across the street, an old man on his stoop watched him for a while, then nodded, almost respectfully, before disappearing inside. A group of teenage boys passed by and glanced at him. Then one of them muttered, "That's the dude from the video." Elijah didn't respond. He just kept sweeping. The rumors spread faster than the truth. Some said he had sued the city already. Others said he was a con man who got lucky. But most didn't know anything about him. They didn't know about the couch he used to sleep on in the church basement. About the way he used to walk 4 miles to work when his car broke down. About how he once spent 6 months building out his mother's porch ramp with his bare hands so she wouldn't have to take the stairs after her hip surgery. They didn't know that, even now, he gave half his earnings to a neighbor with 3 kids and no job. All they saw was a quiet man with tired eyes and calloused hands, standing in front of a building no one believed he could own. Later that week, Elijah went to the hardware store to get supplies. The cashier, a middle-aged white woman with heavy makeup and a distracted air, glanced at him and tapped the counter twice, as if hurrying him along. He placed a hammer, some screws, a tub of plaster, and a single light bulb on the belt. She didn't say a word, just scanned and announced the price without looking up. He handed her his card. She sighed. "Card machine's down," she said flatly. "Cash only." Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out the exact amount. She took the bills with 2 fingers, as though they might burn her. On his way out, another customer leaned in behind him and said quietly, "Don't let it get to you, man." Elijah gave a small nod, but his face stayed unreadable. He had long learned not to give people more than they deserved. On his way home, it started to rain. He stopped at a corner store to buy a tarp. Inside, a young woman pushed past him without a word. The clerk, barely out of high school, didn't say hello. The line was short, but somehow, Elijah was made to feel like he was in the way. Again, he stepped out into the drizzle with the tarp tucked under one arm. And just as he turned the corner, he saw the same police car from before parked a few blocks down. The same officers inside. One of them glanced in his direction. Elijah paused. The officer lowered his gaze, started the engine, and drove off. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. That night, Elijah lit a single lamp in the living room of the building. It was the only working fixture so far. The rest of the space was shadows and cracked paint, a bare mattress on the floor, a chair with a missing leg. He sat there, listening to the rain hitting the boarded-up windows. Then he heard it. A knock. Slow. Uncertain. He stood, approached the door cautiously, and opened it a few inches. A young boy stood there. Soaked. No more than 10 years old. "You own this place now?" the boy asked. Elijah blinked. "Yeah. It used to be my aunt's. Before they sold it." Elijah opened the door wider. "You want to come in out the rain?" The boy hesitated, then stepped inside. Just for a minute. Just for the warmth. The boy's name was Jalen. He came by again the next day. Then the day after that. Said he liked watching Elijah fix things. Said his mom was always tired, and he didn't like staying at home when her boyfriend was there. Elijah didn't ask questions, just handed the kid a screwdriver and showed him how to take apart a rusted door hinge. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. Sometimes, dignity is passed down without words. The next Sunday, Elijah put on his cleanest shirt and headed to the bank. He wanted to open a small business account. A loan officer called his name, glanced up, then frowned. "We need a second form of ID," she said before even looking at the documents. Elijah provided it. Still, she took longer than usual. Her tone clipped, professional in the way cold water is professional. After a long wait, she finally said, "We'll contact you in a few days." He thanked her. She didn't reply. He walked back home, shoulders stiff, but steps steady. On the way, a woman dropped her grocery bag in front of him. Eggs cracked on the pavement. She looked at him, then at the mess, then at him again. "Great," she muttered. "Figures." Elijah crouched and helped her pick up what he could. She didn't thank him. She just took the bag and walked off. He didn't tell anyone about it. Not Jalen. Not the lawyer who still called now and then to check on the progress of the renovations. Not even the pastor who'd offered to come bless the building. He didn't want pity. He didn't want anger. He wanted to work. He wanted to finish what he started. That evening, he sat down on the floor with an old photo of his mother. She was smiling in the picture, her hair wrapped in a scarf, her eyes bright. He remembered how she used to hum while folding laundry, how she used to say, "They can take your job, baby, but they can't take your peace unless you hand it over." He looked at the photo for a long time, then whispered, "I didn't hand it over, Mama. Not then. Not now." But behind him, unseen, a camera hidden in the hallway corner blinked red. It had recorded every moment since the day he walked in. Every act of care. Every moment of grace under pressure. The lawyer had installed it for security reasons. But it had become something else. A silent witness. And somewhere, someone was watching. A man in a sleek office, with graying hair and a tie loosened at the neck, leaned forward in his chair and replayed a clip of Elijah handing a sandwich to a homeless woman who had curled up outside his door 2 nights earlier. The man didn't speak, just clicked pause, then clicked play again. The video played on, and Elijah, unaware, swept the stoop the next morning like it was a sacred ritual. Still, the world hadn't stopped pushing him. A few days later, he walked into City Hall to file a permit. The clerk asked for his name, then checked the computer. "You sure you own this place?" the man asked, half joking. Kinda surprised, no offense. Elijah said, "No offense taken," and passed him the deed. It had his name in bold at the top. Elijah Booker, owner. He walked out with the permit in hand, but the weight of the looks behind him still clung to his shoulders. He was tired, not of the work, not of the rain or the cracked walls or the city red tape, but of being questioned, of being doubted, of being judged for just being there. And yet, he kept going, day after day, paint on his hands, splinters in his palms, one wall at a time, one pipe, one floorboard, one moment of peace carved out of noise. What he didn't know was that someone had taken a still from the viral video and turned it into a meme. It said, "This man was arrested for standing in front of what he owns." Read that again. It had been shared 500,000 times in 3 days. Elijah didn't care about likes. He cared about finish lines. But the world had begun to notice. And the story he thought would disappear had only just begun to ripple outward. Still, he said nothing. Just kept working, kept helping, kept waiting. For what, he didn't know. He wasn't expecting anything. But life had other plans. And someone had been watching. All along. Rain fell harder that night. It drummed against the roof like a warning. Inside the building, Elijah worked under the dim yellow light of a single lamp, spreading sealant along a cracked window frame. The storm had come fast, sudden, and the tarp he'd laid across the top floor wasn't holding. Water dripped steadily onto the floorboards above. He climbed the narrow staircase, stepped over exposed beams, and placed a bucket beneath the leak. That's when he noticed the window had been shattered. Not by wind. A brick sat on the floor nearby, soaked and streaked with grime. He looked at it, then at the window, then slowly sat down beside it. No note, no message, just the silence of being unwelcome. The next morning, he arrived at the local hardware store to buy another pane. But this time, the manager stopped him at the door. "Can't let you in," the man said, arms crossed. Elijah blinked. "Why? We got a complaint last week. Said someone saw you stealing screws. We checked the cameras. Couldn't prove it, but the owner doesn't want to take chances." Elijah didn't argue. He just turned and left. Out on the sidewalk, the sky was clear, but everything inside him felt storm-tossed. He walked 3 more blocks to another store where no one recognized him. He paid in cash. No questions asked. No eye contact either. Just the quiet ache of being unseen when you're trying to be upright. That afternoon, a city inspector came by unannounced. A stern woman with a clipboard and sharp heels. She didn't greet him, just stepped into the foyer, took a deep breath, and started snapping photos. "You don't have the proper ventilation here," she said, pointing toward the exposed beams. "This stairwell's too narrow, and the railing's missing." Elijah explained he was mid-renovation, that he'd already filed for permits, that the plans were in motion. She barely looked up. "You'll need to shut the top 2 floors until this is corrected," she said, tearing off a notice and slapping it on the wall. Violation Code 5.3. He didn't protest, didn't flinch, just nodded, thanked her, and walked her out, then stood in the doorway, watching her car disappear into the turning traffic. That night, Jalen didn't show up. First time in a week. Elijah sat alone, eating cold soup from a tin can, staring at the empty seat across from him. He wondered if the boy's mother had forbidden it, or if someone else had warned him off. The silence was heavier than usual. He turned on the old radio in the corner, hoping for some company. Static, then gospel. A woman's voice sang softly about trials and mercy. He let it play, let it fill the cracks. The next day, a letter arrived in the mail. Folded once. No return address. Just his name. Inside, a typed note on plain white paper. "You don't belong here. Sell and leave. While you still can." No signature. Just the weight of history echoing inside a single envelope. Elijah read it twice, then folded it, placed it back inside, and tucked it into a drawer. He didn't tell anyone. Not the lawyer. Not the police. Not even Jalen, who returned the following evening with a bruised lip and no explanation. They sat in silence for an hour, fixing a broken drawer in the kitchen. No words needed. The silence was their shared language now. Elijah thought of quitting. Just for a moment. That night, as he lay on the thin mattress listening to the wind whistle through the walls, he wondered what it would feel like to walk away. To sell it all and disappear into a quieter life. Maybe somewhere where no one knew his name. No one assumed. No one accused. But the thought vanished as quickly as it came. Because he remembered his mother. Remembered her voice, her hands, her fight. Remembered the porch she never got to sit on. Remembered the promise he'd made beside her hospital bed, holding her hand while machines beeped and nurses moved like ghosts in the background. He whispered then, "I'll build something you'd be proud of." And so, walking away was not an option. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, he opened the front door to find his car had been keyed. Deep gashes across the hood. Racial slurs etched with cruel precision. A flat tire. A broken side mirror. He stood there for a long time, not moving. Then walked back inside. Got his coat. Called a tow. He didn't react the way some might expect. No shouting, no fists, just a quiet phone call and a deeper breath. But something inside him cracked. Later that day, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, his shirt soaked with sweat, his hands trembling after hours of work. He looked at himself, the lines under his eyes, the quiet rage at the corners of his mouth. He whispered to his own reflection, "Why is it never enough?" No one answered. He didn't expect them to. 2 days passed, then 3. Then a letter came from the city. A second violation. This time a fine. Then a notice from a neighboring business accusing him of trespassing on shared property. He hadn't. But proving innocence was never as easy as proving guilt. He mailed a response, filled out the appeal forms, attached receipts, but all of it felt like sandbags on his back. One evening, walking down the block to get a sandwich, he overheard a conversation at the corner bodega. A woman whispered to a man, "He's still there. I thought the cops would have run him out by now." Elijah didn't stop, didn't confront them, just kept walking, the cold wind blowing up through his sleeves, the bag of tools on his shoulder like armor. Inside the building, he found another surprise. Someone had broken in, not to steal, just to scatter. His papers were everywhere. Paint cans tipped, a smear of black ink across the floor. The bucket beneath the leak had been kicked over. He sank to his knees, picking up each page, slowly, methodically, like piecing back a shattered frame. That night, he wrote a letter. He didn't know to whom. Just started writing. "I don't know why you hate me. I don't know why me fixing something makes you afraid. Maybe it's not about me. Maybe it's about what I remind you of. But I won't leave. I won't be scared. I won't erase myself to make you more comfortable." He folded the paper, burned it in a tin can, watched the smoke rise, gray and silent. The following morning, Jalen came running into the building, out of breath, holding a phone. "Mr. Elijah, you're on the news." Elijah frowned, took the phone, and saw it. A segment. Local man wrongfully arrested, now rebuilding with his own hands. The footage rolled. Him in handcuffs, then him sweeping, then a brief interview with the lawyer, then the officer, the same officer, standing in front of a podium, eyes downcast. "We made a mistake," he said, voice tight. "I made a mistake. I'm sorry." The room was quiet. Elijah handed the phone back. Jalen asked, "Are you mad?" Elijah said nothing, just walked to the window, stared out at the street. The light was different now, softer somehow, the wind calmer, as if the city had paused, just briefly, to consider the weight of what had been done. And in the corner of the room, the security camera blinked again, recording, witnessing, holding it all in silent memory. Because sometimes, the world only learns after being shown its own reflection. And sometimes, the most broken place is where the light begins to pour through. But Elijah wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the ceiling, the patch of wall that needed sanding, the light fixture he wanted to install before nightfall. Because while the world watched, he was still living, still building, still standing in the very place they told him he didn't belong, and refusing, every day, to believe them. It started with the knock of polished shoes on hollow floors. Elijah was upstairs sealing drywall when he heard it, 3 firm raps, unhurried, deliberate. He came down, wiping dust from his forearms with the sleeve of his old sweatshirt. The man at the door wore a dark gray suit and carried a leather briefcase. His presence didn't match the cracked paint or the rusting hinges. Elijah opened the door slowly, wary. "Mr. Booker?" the man asked, voice calm but crisp. Elijah nodded. "I'm Julian Strauss. I work with Halbier and Rowe. We represent several private foundations and city development projects. May I come in?" Elijah hesitated, then stepped aside. The man's eyes scanned the room as he entered, taking in the unfinished walls, the raw honesty of the space. He didn't seem uncomfortable. He seemed deliberate. They sat on opposite sides of the old wooden table Elijah had salvaged from a thrift store. Julian opened the briefcase, pulled out a folder, and slid it forward. "You've been watched, Mr. Booker," he said plainly. "Not in the way you're thinking. Not with suspicion. With admiration." Elijah raised an eyebrow. Julian continued. "Someone submitted your story to the Urban Renewal Coalition last week, along with video footage. A lot of it. The security camera, footage from the arrest, images of your renovations, even clips of you helping that boy, Jalen, I believe." Elijah didn't reply, just nodded once. Julian leaned forward. "That footage reached people who make decisions. People who thought this building was just another neglected property. People who now see it very differently. And more importantly, who see you very differently. He opened the folder. Inside were papers, letters, a printed email, photos. Elijah picked them up one by one, unsure of what he was looking at. "You've been offered a grant, Mr. Booker," Julian said. "A sizable one. Enough to finish the building. Legally. Safely. Without interruption." Elijah froze. "Why?" he asked. Julian smiled faintly. "Because you've already done the hardest part. You stayed." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Elijah wasn't used to handouts. Not used to praise. Not used to the world handing him anything except obstacles. He stared down at the papers, then looked back at Julian. "And what do you want from me?" he asked. Julian closed the briefcase. "Nothing. Except that you keep doing what you're doing." Then he stood. "Oh, and one more thing," he added as he reached the door. "You're scheduled to appear on Channel 4 tomorrow night. A community spotlight segment. Don't worry. They already cleared it with your lawyer." And with that, he walked out, footsteps echoing like punctuation in an unfinished sentence. Elijah sat alone at the table for a long time. The papers still spread out before him. He didn't touch them again that night. He just looked at them, not with excitement, not with pride, with stillness, as if afraid they might vanish if he reached for them too quickly. The next day, a news van arrived just after noon. A small crew. A kind-faced reporter named Lisa. She didn't press, didn't pry, just asked him to tell the story in his own words. He spoke quietly, carefully, not about injustice, not about anger. He spoke about his mother, about promises, about nails and wood and holding on when everything told him to let go. The crew filmed the empty hallways, the slow progress, the paint cans lined up in the corner. And when they left a silence so gentle it almost felt like respect. But that wasn't the only visit. Later that week, the same officer who had arrested him stood at the front gate. No uniform this time, just a plain blue shirt, jeans, and the look of a man carrying something heavy. Elijah opened the door, but said nothing. The officer cleared his throat. I needed to come here. In person. I know you don't owe me anything, but I owe you an apology." Elijah's face was unreadable. The officer continued. "That day, I didn't see you. I saw what I was trained to see. A man standing alone, in front of a building. And I jumped to a conclusion I can't take back." He held up a printed sheet. "They asked me to read this on live TV, and I did. But it didn't feel like enough. So I came here. To say it as a man." Elijah looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in," he said. The officer hesitated, then crossed the threshold. They didn't talk long. Just enough for the man to see what he hadn't seen before, to understand what was missed. When he left, he turned back at the door. "This place, it's going to be something." Elijah didn't smile. He didn't need to. "It already is," he said. The footage aired that night. The apology. The story. The quiet dignity of a man who had every reason to burn the world down and instead chose to build something in it. Messages poured in. Letters. Donations. Offers of support. But Elijah remained steady, accepting help only where needed, redirecting the rest to local shelters, food banks, the church that had once given him a cot in the cold. Even the people who had once doubted him began to change. The hardware store manager called him back, apologized, offered him store credit. Elijah declined, but he did shake the man's hand. The city inspector returned, this time with a second clipboard and a smile. "We reviewed your plans again. You're clear to open the top floors." And through it all, Elijah never once raised his voice, never demanded recognition, never shouted his victory into the sky. He simply kept working, each nail driven with quiet purpose, each coat of paint another layer of healing. Jalen began bringing his little sister with him on Saturdays. She'd sit cross-legged in the hallway and color while the two of them fixed window frames. One day she looked up at Elijah and said, "Mama says you're the building man." Elijah chuckled. Something like that. But inside, something bloomed. Then came the day the city unveiled a new community mural just 3 blocks away. Bright colors, bold shapes, and in the center, a man in a navy coat, standing with a hammer in one hand and a key in the other. Below it, the words, "Belonging is not permission. It is birthright." No name, no plaque, but everyone knew. Elijah didn't pose for photos, didn't attend the ceremony. He was at home, fixing a sink in one of the newly finished apartments. But Jalen ran in and showed him a picture on his phone. "That's you," he grinned. Elijah looked at it, then simply said, "Let's get this drain working." Because the true measure of worth was never in applause. It was in the things built when no one was watching. The walls that stood, the roofs that held, the people who stayed. And at the end of that day, as the last rays of sun slanted across the room, Elijah stood at the window looking out. The street was the same, but the way people looked at him was not. Some nodded, others waved. A few just paused, as if unsure how to greet the man they once doubted. Elijah responded to each with the same calm nod. No bitterness, no pride, just presence. He was not a hero. He didn't want to be. He just wanted to finish what he started. And maybe, in doing that, show others that sometimes the loudest statement is a quiet refusal to disappear. That night, he lit the hallway lamps one by one. Warm light spilled across the floors. And for the first time, the building felt like a home. Not just for him, but for everyone who might walk through its doors. And in a world still learning how to see, Elijah Booker stood not as a symbol, but as a reminder. That grace is not weakness. That dignity is not volume. That ownership is not something granted by others. It is something claimed in the face of silence. And held, brick by brick, without apology. Morning came softly, sunlight spilling through clean windows and warming the wooden floorboards Elijah had sanded smooth with his own hands. The building had changed, not just structurally, but spiritually. The scent of fresh paint had faded, replaced by the aroma of brewed coffee from the small kitchen downstairs. The silence that once echoed through the hollow halls was now filled with gentle footsteps, with laughter, with the quiet rhythm of life returning. Elijah stood in the doorway of one of the upper units, looking at the finished space. The walls were a soft cream, the cabinets new but modest, the window trimmed with a second-hand curtain a neighbor had offered. It wasn't luxury, but it was real, and it was his. Not just the deed, but the work, the purpose, the patience. A few weeks had passed since the apology aired on television. The city moved on quickly, as it always did. But Elijah stayed. Each morning, he swept the front steps before the neighborhood stirred. A small habit his mother had taught him. Take care of what's yours before the world has a chance to question it. Jalen came by most days, usually with a story to tell, and sometimes with nothing to say at all. Elijah never pushed. He let the boy sit in silence if that's what he needed. Let him learn how to repair doorknobs, mix plaster, patch baseboards. The building had become more than shelter. It had become a rhythm, a heartbeat, a testament. One Tuesday morning, Elijah received a letter in the mail. It wasn't typed. It was written in careful cursive, with shaky strokes and faded ink. "Mr. Booker," it began, "I used to live across the street from that building when I was a girl. My father worked nights, and my mother made sandwiches for the kids in the neighborhood. That place was always full of noise, full of life. Until it wasn't. I watched it fall apart. I never thought anyone would bring it back. But then I saw you. Thank you." There was no signature, just the return address of an assisted living home and a single pressed flower tucked inside. Elijah kept that letter. He placed it on the mantel above the radiator in the front room, next to a framed photo of his mother and a chipped mug filled with pins and screws. He never said anything about it to anyone, but every so often, he'd stop and reread it, especially on the hard days. By the end of the month, the building had 4 tenants. A single mother and her son who'd been evicted from their last apartment without notice. A retired teacher who'd lost her savings in a housing scam. A young couple saving to start a bakery. And a man fresh out of prison, referred by the reentry nonprofit Elijah, now donated to quietly each month. They paid modest rent, just enough to keep the lights on and the repairs going. But more importantly, they respected the space. Respected him. The hallway became something of a meeting place. People left messages on a small corkboard Elijah hung by the mailboxes. Requests for help moving furniture. A flyer for a weekend cookout. A thank you note from the couple upstairs who found a bouquet of fresh flowers at their door after their baby was born. Elijah never admitted he left them. He just nodded when they brought it up and said, "That's a good neighbor right there." People who once crossed the street to avoid eye contact now stopped to wave. The man from the corner store started slipping him a free bottle of water every Friday. A teacher from the local school invited him to speak to her class about perseverance. He declined, politely, saying he wasn't much for speeches. But he sent them a toolbox full of supplies and a note that read, "Teach them how to build." The rest will come. Even the hardware store, the one that once turned him away, posted a photo of Elijah on their community board under the heading Local Builder Spotlight. He walked past it one day without stopping, but the cashier saw his reflection in the window and gave him a quiet thumbs up. Elijah nodded once and kept walking. Despite all the praise, Elijah never changed his pace. He wore the same coat, used the same tools, and kept the same early mornings. He didn't move into a bigger house or upgrade his car. He lived in one of the small units, right on the second floor, the one with the squeaky floorboard in the hallway and the best view of the sunrise. He cooked simple meals, listened to jazz at night, and called his aunt once a week just to check in. She always asked the same question, "You doing okay, baby?" And he always answered, "I'm still here." But even in peace, echoes of the past found ways to return. One afternoon, a woman stood at the edge of the property, staring at the building like it held a memory she couldn't shake. Elijah stepped outside and nodded a greeting. She walked up slowly. "You don't remember me," she said, voice low. He studied her face. "Faintly familiar. I worked the desk at the precinct. The day they brought you in." Her eyes filled. "I wanted to say something then, but I didn't. I just filed your name and closed the folder. I'm sorry." Elijah didn't speak right away. Then finally, "Thank you for telling me." She reached into her purse and handed him a folded piece of paper. "I left the department last month. I teach now. Thought you might want to see this." He unfolded it. A lesson plan. A unit titled Bias, Perception, and the Power of Dignity. The first slide? A still image from the video. Him, standing calmly, refusing to be erased. He didn't know what to say, so he didn't. He just offered her a tour of the building. She accepted. At the end, she hugged him before she left. Not with pity, with respect. Elijah's name began to appear in places he never expected. On community awards, in neighborhood newsletters, in the quiet prayers of people who had once given up. He didn't go to the award ceremonies. But when a plaque arrived in the mail, he used it to level the bookshelf that wobbled in the front hallway. Still, he gave more than he took. On Sundays, he volunteered at the same shelter he once slept in. He handed out meals, fixed a broken lock on the bathroom door, and repaired a flickering light in the hallway without being asked. Most people didn't recognize him, and he never introduced himself. But the staff knew, and they made sure there was always a warm plate and a quiet chair waiting for him when he was done. He never stopped fixing things, because to him, fixing was a kind of prayer, a way to stay grounded, a way to remember that the cracks in a building weren't always flaws. Sometimes, they were proof that something had endured. One evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops, Elijah sat on the front steps. Jalen sat beside him, munching on an apple. The boy looked up and said, "They say you're a hero." Elijah smiled faintly. "I still on the horizon." "I'm not," he said. "I just stayed." And in that silence, between the fading daylight and the whisper of wind through the trees, something deeper settled. A sense of peace, a quiet, earned belonging. And across the street, in the reflection of the glass, the building stood tall, whole, honest, and filled with light. Elijah sat in the old wooden chair on the front porch, the same one he'd found abandoned behind a dumpster 3 blocks away and sanded down to something smooth, almost elegant. The morning was quiet, the street still asleep except for the soft sweep of wind dragging leaves across the sidewalk. Across the street, a young woman pushed a stroller. She looked up, caught his gaze, and offered a small smile. Elijah returned it, slow and warm. The baby looked up at him too, eyes wide and bright, and for a moment the whole world felt still. He stayed like that for a long time, the way a man does when he knows he's not waiting for anything anymore. The fight, the proving, the noise, it had quieted. The building behind him stood complete, not just finished in construction, but filled with lives. Light spilled through every window. The sounds of a radio drifted from the second floor. A small dog barked from a balcony. Someone laughed. The walls that had once echoed with silence now held stories, routines, memories being made quietly. Elijah stood and walked slowly inside, his hand brushing the frame of the door as he passed through it. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. He passed a shelf lined with small offerings, thank you notes from tenants, a pair of baby shoes left behind and never claimed, a framed photo of the first group who moved in after the renovations. At the end of the hall, he paused at a bulletin board. Someone had added a new note. Neighborhood Cleanup Day, Mr. Booker will be there. Will you? He smiled and shook his head. He hadn't written that. But someone had. And that said enough. He stepped into the back room, where the morning sun poured through a tall window. A new tenant, a young man just starting community college, had painted a mural on the far wall, a quiet portrait of the building itself, surrounded by trees that weren't yet planted but would be. At the base of the mural, written in neat white letters, "You belong here." Later that day, he took a walk through the neighborhood. People nodded. A few stopped him. One woman thanked him for helping her son find his first job. A man from the barber shop pressed a fresh loaf of cornbread into his hands without a word. On the sidewalk outside the community center, someone had chalked a line that read, "What you build with love cannot be broken." When he returned home, there was a letter waiting in the mail. From a local high school, a student had written an essay titled "The Man Who Built a House" in a lesson. It spoke of dignity, of strength without arrogance, of the kind of role model that doesn't teach by talking but by walking. Elijah folded the letter and placed it gently in the drawer beside the flower-pressed note from the old woman and the signed blueprint from the city. He didn't need trophies. These were better. That evening, just as the sun kissed the rooftops and turned everything gold, Elijah climbed the stairs to the roof. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking out over the city. The same city that had once tried to erase him. The same city that now carried his footprints. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But something had shifted. In him. Around him. Maybe even because of him. He stayed there as the sky turned deep purple. The lights of the street came on one by one, flickering like stars reclaiming the night. He heard the door below open, footsteps on the stairs. Jalen appeared beside him, older now, taller, still carrying that quiet awe in his eyes. "You ever gonna leave this place?" he asked. Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked out, past the buildings, past the trees, toward the horizon. "I already did," he said. "And I came back." They stood side by side, neither saying more, just watching the city breathe beneath them. And somewhere below, in a hallway lit with soft yellow light, a young tenant showed another child how to patch a crack in the wall using a putty knife Elijah had once placed gently in his hand. On the far wall near the entryway, someone had hung a framed photo. It was grainy, taken from the day of Elijah's arrest, before the world knew who he was, before anyone believed he belonged. He stood in that photo in handcuffs, his chin slightly raised, eyes steady. And next to that photo, in the same frame, a second one. Him standing on the porch with the keys in his hand, head tilted in almost the same way, but smiling. No one wrote captions. None were needed. Outside, on the bench across from the building, a group of teenagers sat sharing music from a phone. One pointed to the building. "That's his, you know. The man they tried to take down. He just kept building." Elijah didn't hear it. He didn't need to. He was already home, and at the edge of the sky, where the light touched the rooftops and made everything shimmer with possibility, a simple truth lingered like a whisper too soft to speak, but too powerful to ignore. Sometimes, all it takes to change everything is to stay standing when the world says sit down, to build when others break, to belong without waiting for permission. Thank you for watching this story from Cracks of Light. If it moved you, if you felt seen, or if you believe in stories that remind us what quiet strength looks like, subscribe to our channel, leave us a comment, and share this video. We share these moments not just to remember, but to remind that light always finds a way through, especially through the cracks.